Take a slow, deep breath and step quietly into the past. Tonight, we travel to feudal Japan, a land of castles, mountains, and silent warriors. Behind tall wooden walls and stone fortresses, samurai endured long nights, cold winters, and endless sieges. With discipline, patience, and careful planning, they learned how to survive when supplies were low and danger was everywhere. This is an original FMTJ history story, based on real events and research. So relax, close your eyes, and let this peaceful journey guide you through the hidden world of samurai resilience.
The samurai at Hara Castle had been eating tree bark for 3 months. Their water supply had turned brackish, the rice stores were gone, and the shogun's army surrounded them on all sides. Yet they held the walls. They held through winter storms, through artillery bombardment, through wave after wave of assault. Understanding how they did this reveals something profound about feudal warfare that most people completely misunderstand. When we picture medieval sieges, we imagine dramatic battles, armies clashing, walls crumbling, heroes emerging. The reality was far more mundane and infinitely more brutal. Sieges weren't won through courage or tactical genius. They were won through preparation, routine, and the willingness to endure conditions that would break most modern armies within days. The typical Japanese castle siege lasted anywhere from 3 weeks to 18 months. That's not a battle. That's a lifestyle. And the samurai developed an entire culture around surviving these endless stalemates. Let's start with something that sounds simple, but determined everything else. Water. You can survive weeks without food. You'll suffer, you'll weaken, but you can function. Without water, you're dead in 3 days, maybe 4 if you're lucky, and the weather is cool. Every castle designer knew this, which is why the first thing they planned wasn't the walls or the towers. It was the wells. Himeji Castle had 43 wells scattered throughout its grounds. Not one central water source that could be poisoned or cut off. 43 separate access points to groundwater. The engineers dug some of these wells over 100 feet deep, boring through solid rock with nothing but iron chisels and human labor. Some took years to complete. The well at Kumamoto Castle was so deep that defenders once hid an entire cache of weapons at the bottom during peacetime, knowing no attacker would think to search there. They retrieved them 30 years later when war came again, the swords still sharp, the spear tips uncorroded. But having water wasn't enough. You had to protect it. During the siege of Odawara Castle in 1590, the Hojo clan stationed guards at every well around the clock, not to prevent theft from other defenders, to prevent sabotage. Because if an infiltrator managed to dump something foul into your water supply, if they managed to poison even one well, panic would spread faster than any disease. Defenders would turn on each other, suspecting everyone, drinking nothing, dying of thirst while surrounded by water they couldn't trust. The psychological dimension of siege warfare ran deeper than the wells themselves. Now, food presents a different kind of problem. You need variety. You need nutrition. A castle full of armed men eating nothing but rice will develop scurvy within 2 months. Their gums will bleed. Their teeth will fall out. Wounds will stop healing. An army with scurvy isn't an army. It's a collection of dying men holding weapons they lack the strength to lift. So castle lords stockpiled with obsessive detail. Rice, yes, but also dried fish, pickled vegetables, fermented soybeans, dried seaweed, salt plums, anything that would keep for years and provide the nutrients needed to prevent deficiency diseases. Kumamoto Castle's food stores in the 1870s still contained supplies laid down in the 1600s. Some of those pickled plums were over 200 years old and still technically edible. The samurai also prepared for food shortages with brutal pragmatism. Most castles maintained detailed lists of who would eat and who wouldn't if supplies ran low. The hierarchy was explicit. Samurai ate first, always. Then the Ashigaru foot soldiers, then servants, then laborers. Women and children came last unless they served essential functions. This sounds cruel, and it was. But from a military perspective, it made perfect sense. A starving samurai couldn't fight. A starving laborer could still carry stones to repair walls, at least for a while longer. Some castles took an even darker approach. They expelled civilians when a siege began. Just opened the gates and forced out anyone who couldn't fight. These people would walk straight into the besieging army, who faced a choice. Let them through, which would allow potential spies to escape, or kill them, which would devastate their own reputation and potentially harden the defenders' resolve. Usually, the besiegers let them through. Sometimes, they didn't. But let's talk about something that often gets overlooked entirely: boredom. A siege isn't constant action. It's not even frequent action. It's days and days of absolutely nothing happening, punctuated by brief moments of terror when someone decides to test the defenses or launch an assault. This psychological grind broke more defenders than starvation. The samurai countered this with rigid routine. Every day had structure. Morning inspections of the walls, weapon maintenance, archery practice, tea ceremonies, poetry competitions. Some castles held formal martial arts demonstrations on the inner grounds, maintaining the rituals of peacetime even as enemy campfires surrounded them on all sides. This wasn't about morale in the way we usually think of it. This was about preventing the human mind from collapsing under the weight of monotony and dread. Give men nothing to do, and they'll think. Let them think too much during a siege, and they'll realize how hopeless their situation is. Keep them busy, keep them moving through familiar patterns, and they'll endure far longer than anyone thought possible. The samurai even maintained formal etiquette during sieges. They would dress properly, observe rank, conduct themselves with the same rigid propriety they would in the shogun's palace. This might seem absurd. Why worry about wearing the correct clothing when you're starving inside a surrounded fortress? But these rituals provided psychological anchors. They reinforced identity. They reminded defenders who they were and what they represented. At Osaka Castle during the winter siege of 1614, defenders held a formal New Year's celebration despite being surrounded by over 200,000 enemy troops. They wore ceremonial dress. They exchanged ritual greetings. They composed poetry about the beauty of snow on pine trees. Then they returned to their positions on the walls and continued fighting. The physical structure of castles reflected this need to endure. Japanese castles weren't designed like European fortresses. They didn't rely on massive stone walls and towers. Instead, they used a maze-like design with multiple defensive rings, each one a separate fortress within the larger complex. This meant that even if attackers breached the outer walls, they hadn't won. They'd simply entered another killing ground. Defenders could fall back to the next ring, then the next, making attackers pay for every inch of ground. Some castles had 7 or 8 of these defensive rings, each with its own gates, walls, and strongpoints. The gates themselves were masterpieces of defensive design. They didn't open straight. They turned at right angles, forcing attackers to slow down and bunch up in enclosed spaces where defenders above could drop stones, pour boiling water, or shoot arrows straight down into the packed mass of men below. These weren't just architectural features. They were psychological weapons. Every gate an attacker breached only revealed another gate beyond it. Every wall they climbed only showed another wall behind it. The castle seemed endless, impossible to fully capture, designed to drain hope from anyone trying to take it by force. Which brings us to what really determined whether a siege succeeded or failed: the mathematics of supply lines. The besieging army needed food and water too, often more than the defenders, because they couldn't forage in one area for months without exhausting local resources. They had to maintain supply lines stretching back to friendly territory, and those lines became targets, Defenders would send out small raiding parties at night to attack supply convoys, burn food stores, ambush reinforcements. If you were besieging a castle, you weren't just fighting the men inside the walls. You were fighting time itself, watching your own supplies dwindle, wondering if your lords would continue sending food and equipment month after month while you sat in the mud, achieving nothing visible. Many sieges ended not because the defenders ran out of food, but because the attackers did. Or because the attackers' lords decided the campaign was costing too much for too little gain. Or because another enemy threatened from a different direction, forcing the besiegers to abandon their camps and march away, leaving the defenders victorious through sheer endurance. The siege of Odawara lasted 3 months. The siege of Osaka lasted twice that. The siege of Hara Castle, where defenders ate bark and held the walls, stretched through an entire winter. In each case, the samurai inside weren't superhuman. They were following procedures developed over centuries, refined through experience, designed specifically to outlast any attacker willing to sit outside and wait. But there was one element of siege survival that determined everything else. One factor that could make even the best supplied castle fall within weeks. It wasn't food or water or morale or defensive architecture. It was something far more fundamental to human nature, and understanding it reveals why some garrisons held for months while others collapsed almost immediately. That factor was leadership. Not the inspirational kind you see in movies, something more practical, more immediate. When you're trapped inside walls with finite supplies and an enemy waiting outside, someone has to decide who gets how much food, who stands watch when, who repairs which section of wall, who sleeps where. Every single decision about resource allocation falls to whoever commands the garrison, and those decisions compound over time into either survival or collapse. The samurai understood this completely. Castle garrisons didn't have democratic councils or group discussions about strategy. They had a clear chain of command, usually led by a senior retainer of the daimyo who owned the castle. This commander had absolute authority over everything inside the walls. He decided the rationing schedule. He assigned defensive positions. He determined when to sortie against besiegers and when to stay behind walls. And critically, he controlled information. Defenders didn't know what was happening outside. They couldn't see beyond their walls except from the highest towers. They didn't know if reinforcements were coming. They didn't know if their lord had won battles elsewhere or lost them. They didn't know if the army outside was growing stronger or weaker. The commander decided what information to share, what rumors to suppress, what news to announce publicly, and what to keep private. This wasn't about deception. It was about managing the one resource more volatile than food or water: hope. A garrison that believed relief was coming could endure starvation. A garrison that believed they'd been abandoned would surrender with full storehouses. The commander's job was to calibrate hope carefully. Too much optimism and men would waste supplies expecting rescue. Too much pessimism and they'd lose the will to fight. The best siege commanders maintained a state of determined endurance, where defenders believed survival was possible if they followed procedures exactly, where each day became simply another day to get through rather than a countdown to inevitable doom. This required a specific personality type, not the bold, aggressive warriors who earned glory in open battle. Siege commanders were chosen for steadiness, reliability, the ability to make the same rational decision every day, even when bored, even when exhausted, even when terrified. They were administrators as much as warriors, managing logistics and morale with the same attention others gave to sword technique. And they had tools for this. One was ritual, daily routines that never changed regardless of what happened outside. Morning inspections of the walls, afternoon weapon drills, evening roll call. These rituals served no immediate tactical purpose, but they provided structure. They turned indefinite waiting into something predictable, something men could mentally organize themselves around. You weren't trapped for an unknown number of days. You were simply going through today's routine, same as yesterday, same as tomorrow. Another tool was visible fairness in rationing. The commander ate the same portions as common soldiers. Officers received no extra rice, no hidden supplies. This wasn't about equality for its own sake. It was about preventing the suspicion that would rot morale from within. If men believed their leaders were hoarding food while they starved, the garrison would fracture. Defenders would start hiding their own supplies, stealing from each other, fragmenting into factions. The siege wouldn't end from enemy action. It would end from internal collapse. So, commanders made their own hunger visible. They made sure everyone saw them eating thin gruel when that's all anyone got. They made sure everyone knew the storehouses were locked and guarded by trusted men who answered only to the commander himself. They made sure the rationing system seemed mechanical, impersonal, beyond anyone's ability to manipulate. You got your portion because that's what the system allocated, not because of who you were or who you knew. But even perfect leadership couldn't compensate for one specific failure. And this is where many sieges actually ended. Sanitation. You're inside walls with hundreds of men, maybe thousands. You can't leave. Everything that enters must stay inside. That includes human waste. Medieval Japanese castles had latrines built into the walls, designed to dump waste outside the fortifications. But during a siege, those became vulnerabilities. Attackers would watch them, shoot arrows at anyone using them, sometimes even try to climb up through them. So defenders often blocked them off, which meant waste accumulated inside the castle grounds. This created cascading problems. The smell was unbearable, but that was the least of it. Waste contaminated water supplies if not managed carefully. It drew flies, which spread disease. It created conditions where a single illness could sweep through the entire garrison in days, killing more men than enemy arrows ever would. Some castles fell not because they ran out of food, but because dysentery killed so many defenders they couldn't man the walls anymore. The solution was systematic waste management. Designated areas away from water sources and living quarters, covering waste with dirt daily, burning it when possible, rotating the men assigned to this duty so no one group bore the burden constantly. It was unglamorous work, the opposite of samurai honor and glory, but siege commanders who neglected it lost their garrisons to disease rather than combat. Which brings us back to why castles were designed the way they were. Every architectural feature served this long-term survival strategy. Wells were placed in multiple locations, so if one became contaminated, others remained usable. Storehouses were separated so fire in one wouldn't destroy all supplies. Living quarters were distributed throughout the castle rather than concentrated in one area, preventing a single attack from killing too many defenders at once. The outer walls weren't just barriers. They were buffers that gave defenders space to manage all these survival problems. The maze-like interior gave them room to retreat and regroup if sections became uninhabitable due to damage or disease. The multiple defensive rings meant they could abandon contaminated areas and fall back to clean ones, essentially treating their own castle like a series of temporary positions rather than one fixed defense. Now consider what this meant for attackers. They weren't just fighting the garrison. They were fighting a system designed to outlast them. Every day they sat outside was a day their own supplies diminished. Their own men grew restless. Their own lords questioned whether this campaign was worth continuing. Meanwhile, the defenders inside had routines, leadership, and architecture, all aligned toward the single goal of endurance. This is why many sieges ended through negotiation rather than starvation or assault. The attacking commander would send messages offering terms. Surrender now, and you can leave with honor. Keep your weapons. March out with banners flying. Wait longer, and we'll show no mercy when we eventually break through. These offers weren't mercy. They were acknowledgement that taking the castle by force might cost more than it was worth. Defenders faced a calculation too. Hold out and maybe relief comes, or maybe you all die when supplies finally run out. Surrender now and you lose the castle, but save your lives and possibly your lord's other holdings through negotiation. Sometimes the honourable choice was surrender. Sometimes it was dying behind walls. The commander had to judge which situation applied, and he had to make that judgment with incomplete information, never quite certain what was happening in the larger war beyond his walls. Some chose death. The garrison at Hara Castle fought until they'd eaten everything, then ate bark, then ate nothing, and still held the walls until they physically couldn't stand anymore. When attackers finally broke through, they found defenders too weak to lift weapons, still positioned at their posts. That wasn't stupidity. That was a command decision that resistance served their lord's interests, even if it meant their own destruction. Others chose negotiation. The garrison at Fushimi Castle held long enough to delay Tokugawa's enemies, then negotiated terms that let them leave alive. They'd served their strategic purpose. Dying pointlessly after that served no one. Both choices were samurai choices, both honoured, both considered equally valid depending on circumstances. This flexibility reveals something crucial about siege warfare that Hollywood always gets wrong. It wasn't about glory or dramatic last stands. It was about cold calculation of strategic value versus cost. A castle's job was to serve its lord's interests. Sometimes that meant holding until death. Sometimes that meant timely surrender. The commander's responsibility was to judge correctly, and his judgment determined whether his men lived or died. But there was one scenario where all this careful planning, all this architecture and leadership and supply management became irrelevant. One situation where castles fell not over months, but over days, where defenders abandoned walls that should have held, where sieges ended almost before they began. Understanding this scenario reveals the ultimate limitation of any fortification, the one weakness that no amount of stone or strategy could overcome: betrayal. Not dramatic movie betrayal with tearful confessions and sword duels. Simple, transactional betrayal. Someone inside decides the other side offers better prospects and opens a gate. That's how Odawara Castle fell in 1590, after barely any fighting. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's forces surrounded it with overwhelming numbers, and key defenders simply calculated that resistance was pointless. Gates opened. The siege ended. All that magnificent defensive architecture became irrelevant the moment someone decided cooperation served their interests better than loyalty. This wasn't rare. This was perhaps the most common way Japanese castles actually fell. Historians focus on the dramatic sieges, the ones that lasted months, because those make better stories. But scan through the actual records, and you'll find castle after castle changing hands because someone inside made a deal. The threat of siege was often enough. Show up with sufficient force, make the right offers to the right people, and walls became decorative. Why did this happen so frequently? Because Japanese feudalism was built on pragmatic loyalty, not absolute devotion. A samurai served his lord as long as that service made strategic sense. Lords understood this. They expected it. When a castle's position became untenable, defending it to the death wasn't honor, it was waste. Better to switch sides, preserve your men and your family, continue serving under new leadership. The system accommodated this. Victorious lords welcomed former enemies who surrendered properly, gave them new positions, incorporated them into new power structures. This created a bizarre dynamic where castle defences had to account for their own garrison as a potential weakness. You couldn't just worry about enemies outside. You had to worry about allies inside who might decide mid-siege that their future lay elsewhere. Some commanders addressed this by holding family members hostage, ensuring loyalty through threat to relatives. Others used honor systems, making elaborate displays of trust to bind defenders emotionally, Still others simply accepted that betrayal was possible and designed their command structure so no single person could open critical defenses alone. But even perfect loyalty couldn't protect against a more fundamental problem: supply lines. Remember those storehouses full of rice? They had to be filled from somewhere. Castles didn't generate food, they consumed it. Every grain came from fields outside the walls, transported in, stored. Control those supply lines before a siege even begins, and the castle's endurance becomes irrelevant. It doesn't matter if you can theoretically hold for 6 months if you only manage to stockpile 3 weeks of rice before the enemy cut off access to your farms. Oda Nobunaga understood this better than perhaps any other warlord. He didn't just besiege castles, he systematically destroyed their economic foundations first. When he went after the Iko-Iki fortresses, he didn't march straight to their walls. He spent months burning the surrounding countryside, destroying crops, killing farmers, making it impossible for the fortresses to resupply. By the time he actually besieged them, they were already starving. The walls still stood. The defenders were still present, but the siege was effectively over before it began. This approach required patience most commanders lacked. It was easier to show up with an army and demand surrender than to spend months on economic warfare. But it was also far more effective. A castle cut off from its resource base wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a prison where the garrison slowly consumed itself. Some castles tried to solve this by controlling massive territories that would be difficult to fully cut off. Osaka Castle's defenders could draw on resources from a huge region, making total blockade nearly impossible. Others built multiple supply routes with hidden paths that might remain open even during siege. A few even established secret agreements with merchants who would smuggle supplies through enemy lines for the right price. Yet all of this still depended on one assumption: that the siege would be conducted according to normal expectations, that the attackers would surround the castle, cut off supplies, and wait. That they'd attempt to starve defenders out rather than break in directly. What happened when someone decided they didn't want to wait? Artillery. Not the massive European cannons that could demolish stone walls, but something arguably more terrifying in the Japanese context. Explosive shells fired over walls into the interior, setting buildings ablaze, killing defenders who thought they were safe behind fortifications. The introduction of firearms to Japan in the mid-1500s changed siege warfare completely. Suddenly, all that wood construction became a catastrophic liability. A castle designed to withstand arrows and prevent climbing became vulnerable to weapons that didn't care about walls. Defenders couldn't see where the next shell would land. They couldn't predict which building would explode into flames. The psychological impact was devastating. Osaka Castle's final siege in 1615 demonstrated this brutally. Tokugawa forces brought cannon and simply bombarded the interior. One shell reportedly landed near the room where the defenders' leader was meeting with his mother, terrifying her so badly that she pushed for negotiations. The castle itself remained largely intact. Its walls still stood. Its defenses were still functional, but the people inside couldn't endure the constant bombardment. They surrendered not because the castle had failed, but because the experience of being inside it had become unbearable. This reveals something crucial about fortification. The castle wasn't just a military structure. It was a human environment. Defenders had to live inside it, day after day, under increasingly terrible conditions. Architecture could protect against assault. It couldn't protect against fear, exhaustion, despair. The strongest walls in Japan couldn't stop men from breaking psychologically. Some castles adapted. They reduced wood construction, added more stone, created better fire response systems. But this was expensive and time-consuming. Most castles never received these upgrades. They remained vulnerable to the same tactics that had defeated Osaka, sitting there looking impressive while containing a fundamental weakness that any attacker with artillery could exploit. Even without artillery, fire was always the ultimate threat. Attackers would launch fire arrows over walls, not aiming for specific targets, just trying to start blazes anywhere they could. Defenders had organized fire response teams with water buckets stationed throughout the castle. They practiced fire drills. They cleared flammable material from certain areas. But one successful fire in the right location could gut a castle from the inside while its walls stood untouched. Some sieges became battles against fire rather than battles against enemies. Defenders spent more effort controlling blazes than fighting attackers. If the wind picked up, a single fire could spread faster than response teams could contain it. Entire castles burned while their garrisons stood helplessly watching, unable to abandon their posts, but equally unable to save the structures behind them. Ashikaga Yoshiteru's residence burned during an attack in 1565 while he fought in the hallways. He didn't die to enemy swords. He died from smoke inhalation while still holding his position. The building's defensive design, all those narrow corridors that should have protected him, instead trapped smoke and turned the interior into a furnace. His final stand happened not on walls or in courtyards, but in smoke-filled darkness, defending a position that was killing him as effectively as any enemy. This is what siege warfare actually looked like. Not glorious battles or dramatic standoffs. Desperate fire management, psychological endurance tests, calculation of when betrayal served better than loyalty, waiting in smoke and fear while supplies diminished and leaders made choices about whose lives to spend and when. The castles that survived weren't necessarily the strongest or best defended. They were the ones whose commanders correctly judged when to fight and when to negotiate, whose supply lines stayed open longest, whose garrisons remained loyal, or at least functional, whose luck held when fire arrows flew and shells exploded. Because that's what it often came down to. Luck. You could design perfect defenses, stockpile years of supplies, train the most disciplined garrison in Japan, and still lose because one fire arrow landed in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong moment. Or because the lord you served made enemies too powerful to resist. Or because the samurai you trusted to hold the southern gate decided his family's future mattered more than your defense plan. Castle architects understood this. They built the best defenses they could, knowing those defenses would never be perfect. Commanders planned the best strategies they could, knowing those strategies might become irrelevant. Defenders trained and prepared, knowing preparation might not matter. But they did it anyway, because sometimes the castle held. Sometimes the relief force arrived. Sometimes the attacker ran out of patience or resources before the defender did. Sometimes everything that was supposed to work actually worked, and the castle served its purpose, and the garrison survived. Those successes justified the entire system. They made all the other failures acceptable losses. One castle holding at the right moment in the right place could change the outcome of entire campaigns, could buy time for armies to mobilize, could force enemies into negotiations they otherwise wouldn't consider. Himeji Castle never faced a serious siege. It sat there for centuries, all those defenses unused, all that careful planning never tested in actual combat. Was it a failure because it never fought? Or was it the greatest success possible, so imposing that no one wanted to try? That question reveals the ultimate purpose of these fortifications. They weren't really built to withstand sieges. They were built to prevent sieges from happening at all. The most elaborate defensive system ever conceived succeeds by never being used. That's the paradox at the heart of Japanese castle architecture. When Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan in 1600, the era of castle warfare should have ended. Peace meant no more sieges, no more attacks, no more need for fortifications. Instead, castle construction accelerated. The Tokugawa period saw more castle building than any previous era, with designs becoming more sophisticated and defences more elaborate, even as the likelihood of actual combat approached zero. This seems wasteful until you understand what castles had become. They were no longer military installations that happened to house government. They were government installations that happened to look military. The defences served a different purpose now. They projected authority, demonstrated wealth, reminded everyone who held power and what challenging that power would require. Osaka Castle's reconstruction under Tokugawa rule cost more than the original despite being built during peacetime. Why spend that fortune on defences that would never face attack? Because every daimyo visiting Osaka would see those walls and understand exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. The castle didn't need to withstand siege. It needed to make siege unthinkable. This worked because everyone remembered. The wars were recent enough that lords knew precisely what castle assault required. They'd seen the casualties, watched supplies run out, experienced the grinding misery of siege camps. That collective memory made peaceful intimidation possible. The defences didn't need to be tested because everyone knew what testing them would cost. But memory fades. Within 2 generations, most samurai had never seen combat. The carefully maintained castles defended against threats that existed only in history books. Garrisons trained for scenarios that would never occur. Entire military systems perpetuated themselves through sheer institutional momentum. Some domains recognized this and adapted. They converted defensive spaces into administrative offices, turned armories into storage for tax records, maintained the exterior appearance of military readiness while gutting the actual defensive infrastructure. These practical adaptations made sense economically, but they created a strange duality. The castle looked ready for war while being completely unprepared for it. Other domains took the opposite approach. They maintained full military readiness despite having no enemies. Garrisons drilled constantly. Weapons stayed sharp and ready. Defensive systems received regular inspection and repair. This seems more absurd than the first approach until you consider what these domains were actually defending against. Not external enemies. Internal disorder, peasant uprisings, criminal organizations, natural disasters. The defensive systems designed for warfare proved remarkably effective for civil management. High walls kept mobs at bay. Gatehouses controlled population movement. Towers provided surveillance over surrounding territory. The castle's military architecture served peacetime purposes its designers never intended. Fire remained the greatest threat. Not from armies launching incendiary attacks, but from accidents in the castle town. Cooking fires spreading through wooden buildings. Lightning strikes during summer storms. Earthquakes knocking over lanterns. The same defensive concerns that dominated siege warfare applied to peacetime fire management, just with different sources. Edo Castle burned repeatedly, not from attack, but from accidents that the urban density around it made inevitable. Each reconstruction refined the fire management systems. Wider fire breaks, better water access, materials that resisted ignition. These improvements drew directly from military experience, but served civilian needs. The knowledge transfer went both directions. Peacetime castle management revealed defensive weaknesses that warfare never exposed. Long-term occupation showed which designs created maintenance nightmares. Daily use identified bottlenecks and inefficiencies. When castle construction resumed in later periods, these lessons produced better fortifications than pure military theory could have created. Consider water management. Military engineers designed systems to withstand siege by ensuring adequate supply during blockade. Peacetime occupation revealed that these systems also needed to handle sewage, support gardens, provide fire suppression, and maintain moats. The resulting infrastructure far exceeded military requirements, creating complexes that could support larger populations more sustainably. This evolution transformed castles from temporary military installations into permanent urban centers. The fortifications that began as tactical necessities became foundations for city planning. Modern Japanese cities still follow street patterns established by castle town layouts. Neighborhoods preserve names from defensive zones. Urban geography reflects military logic applied centuries ago. Himeji demonstrates this transformation perfectly. It never fought a battle, yet it shaped everything around it. The town developed along routes connecting gates. Commerce concentrated in areas the castle could monitor. Social hierarchy mapped onto defensive zones, with important families closest to the keep and lower classes near outer walls. Military architecture became social architecture without anyone consciously planning the transition. This matters because it reveals what these structures actually accomplished. We judge castles by whether they withstood sieges, but that misses their real function. They organized space, concentrated authority, created frameworks for governance. The military effectiveness, while real, was almost secondary to these broader purposes. When the Meiji Restoration dismantled the feudal system in 1868, most castles lost their official purpose overnight. The new government ordered many demolished, viewing them as symbols of the old order. But destroying these structures proved remarkably difficult. Not just physically, though the construction quality made demolition expensive. Socially, the castles had become so integrated into urban fabric that removing them would devastate surrounding communities. Some domains found creative solutions. They converted castles into government offices, schools, museums, maintained the structures by giving them new purposes. This pragmatic adaptation saved many castles that official preservation efforts would have failed to protect. Others weren't so lucky. Dozens of major castles fell to demolition during the 1870s. Not because they were militarily obsolete, they'd been that for centuries, but because they represented a political order the new government wanted to erase. The defensive systems that had preserved these structures through warfare couldn't protect them from bureaucratic decisions. The castles that survived did so by becoming something else. Tourist attractions, cultural heritage sites, symbols of regional identity. Their defensive features, no longer militarily relevant, became historically significant. The same walls that once kept enemies out now drew visitors in. This final transformation reveals what actually lasts. Not military capability, not defensive strength, cultural meaning. The castles that endure are those that found new purpose beyond their original function. They defend nothing now except their own continued existence, and they do so by being worth preserving rather than worth attacking. Himeji stands today not because its defenses worked, but because people decided they mattered. The elaborate systems designed to withstand siege now withstand time, weather, and neglect through maintenance funded by visitors who come to see what perfect defense looked like. The castle succeeds by being observed rather than being used. This brings us back to the beginning. What were these castles actually for? Defense, obviously, but also administration, economic control, social organization, cultural expression, political theater. They served all these purposes simultaneously, with the military function enabling everything else, but not defining it. The sieges that did occur revealed the limits of defensive architecture. No wall stopped determined attackers indefinitely. No moat proved uncrossable. No defense system eliminated the human factors of leadership, loyalty, and luck. The castles that survived did so through combinations of military capability and non-military factors that pure architectural analysis misses. Understanding this matters because we still build defensively. Different threats, different methods, same underlying logic. We create systems meant to withstand attack, then discover those systems must also function during peace. The balance between defensive readiness and practical utility remains as relevant now as it was for medieval castle architects. Japanese castles solved this tension better than most fortifications. They created structures that served multiple purposes, adapted to changing circumstances, and remained valuable even when their original function became obsolete. That's why they endure. Not because the defenses were perfect, but because they were flexible enough to mean different things in different eras. The ultimate lesson isn't about military architecture, it's about designing for uncertainty. Those castle builders didn't know which threats would materialize or which defenses would prove necessary. They built systems robust enough to handle multiple scenarios, flexible enough to adapt when situations changed, and valuable enough to preserve when their original purpose disappeared. That's what survives. Not the strongest fortification or the cleverest defensive trick. The things that remain useful even when everything changes. Himeji Castle stands today because it became worth saving rather than worth conquering. The defenses that never faced battle won the longest war of all, the one against time and irrelevance. Every abandoned castle in Japan tells the opposite story. Fortifications that served their military purpose perfectly, but failed to find meaning beyond warfare. They crumbled not because their defenses failed, but because no one needed them anymore. The walls held until the moment no one cared whether they held. That's the real test of defensive architecture. Not whether it withstands attack, whether it remains relevant when attack never comes. The samurai at Hara Castle eating bark weren't heroes. They were professionals following procedures until those procedures stopped working. Then they died. That's the actual story of siege warfare, stripped of romance. Most castles never faced what Hara faced. They sat there, expensive and imposing, defending against attacks that never materialized. Were they failures? That question assumes castles existed primarily to fight, which misses the entire point. A castle that prevents attack through intimidation serves its purpose perfectly. Better than one that withstands actual siege, actually, because intimidation costs nothing while defense costs lives. The most successful fortification is the one that never fires a shot because no one wants to test it. This inverts how we typically judge military architecture. We celebrate the castles that held under siege, the desperate last stands, the garrisons that endured impossible conditions. Those make better stories, but they represent system failures, not successes. If your castle faces serious siege, something already went wrong. Either your defenses weren't intimidating enough, or your lord made political miscalculations, or the strategic situation deteriorated beyond what fortification could address. The boring castles, the ones where nothing happened, where garrisons drilled endlessly for battles that never came, where commanders managed supplies that never ran low because no one blockaded them, those succeeded completely. They deterred aggression through mere existence. That was always the primary function, which explains why castle construction accelerated during peacetime. The Tokugawa period saw frantic building precisely because actual warfare had ended. Without combat to prove defensive capability, appearance became everything. Castles had to look impregnable because they'd never demonstrate it through actual siege. The performance of strength replaced strength itself. This created elaborate theatrical productions, garrisons maintaining constant readiness for threats everyone knew wouldn't come, defensive drills perfecting responses to scenarios that were purely hypothetical, supply management systems stockpiling against sieges that peace made impossible. The entire apparatus of siege warfare perpetuated itself as cultural performance rather than military necessity. But that performance had real effects. It organized cities, structured societies, provided frameworks for governance that outlasted their military justification. The walls meant to stop armies, instead channeled commerce, defined neighborhoods, established hierarchies. Defensive architecture became social architecture, so gradually no one noticed the transition. Modern Japan still lives with these structures, not just the physical castles that survived, though those matter. The urban patterns, the social organizations, the administrative systems, all shaped by military logic that no longer applies but continues functioning through institutional momentum. Medieval defensive requirements determine where modern businesses locate, how cities expand, which areas develop prestige. That's the legacy. Not the sieges that happened, but the sieges that didn't. Not the battles fought, but the conflicts prevented. Not the walls that withstood attack, but the walls that made attack unthinkable. Himeji Castle's defences never faced testing, and that's precisely why they worked. The elaborate systems, the redundant water supplies, the maze-like interior, the calculated intimidation of the architecture, all succeeded by making actual siege seem too costly to attempt. Perfect defense through perfect deterrence. This reveals something uncomfortable about fortification generally. The structures we build to resist attack rarely face the attacks we design them for. Either they deter successfully, making combat unnecessary, or they prove inadequate when different threats emerge. The specific scenarios we prepare for almost never occur exactly as anticipated. Japanese castle architects seem to understand this instinctively. They built for general resilience rather than specific threats. Multiple defensive rings that worked against various attack methods. Water systems serving military and civilian needs. Supply storage applicable to siege or peacetime. Flexibility built into supposedly rigid defensive structures. That flexibility explains their survival. When military purpose disappeared, other purposes emerged. Government offices, schools, museums, tourist attractions. The castles adapted because their design never assumed purely military use. The defensive features that should have become obsolete instead became historically significant, protected for cultural rather than tactical reasons. The irony is perfect. Structures built to withstand destruction now require active preservation. Walls designed to stop armies need protection from weather, time, and neglect. Defensive systems that once justified massive investment now depend on tourism and cultural heritage funding. They survive not through strength, but through meaning. This suggests that what lasts isn't what fights best. It's what remains valuable when fighting stops. The castles standing today succeeded not by winning battles, but by mattering beyond warfare. Their military capabilities, while real and sophisticated, proved less important than their cultural resonance. Every castle that fell to demolition in the 1870s demonstrates the opposite. Fortifications that served military purposes perfectly, but failed to develop significance beyond defense. When their tactical function ended, nothing justified their continued existence. They vanished not because their walls failed, but because no one needed those walls anymore. That's the actual test of defensive architecture. Not whether it withstands siege, whether it matters when siege never comes, and whether it remains relevant when its original purpose disappears entirely. By that measure, the castles that never fought succeeded more completely than those that did. The samurai who died at Hara Castle followed their training until the end. The procedures worked exactly as designed, keeping the garrison functional far past the point where most groups would have collapsed. But procedures can't create food from nothing or water from dry wells. Eventually, even perfect execution of defensive protocols fails when resources run out. The castles that survived took a different approach. They found ways to matter beyond their military function. They became centers of administration, symbols of authority, frameworks for social organization. When warfare ended, they transitioned seamlessly because they'd always been more than fortifications. That's what endures, not the strongest defense or the most elaborate preparation. The things that serve multiple purposes, adapt to changing circumstances, and remain valuable regardless of whether the threats they were designed for ever materialize. Himeji Castle stands today not because its defenses were tested and proven, but because they were never tested and remain meaningful anyway. The walls still stand, the gates still function, the defensive systems remain intact. They defend nothing now except their own existence as cultural heritage. That's a different kind of success than withstanding siege, but perhaps a more important one. The castle won by never fighting and continues winning centuries after all potential enemies disappeared.